Hi, this is Small Talk by Scoperta. I am Alessandra, and today we will explore the topic event sourcing and CQRS with our two great guests. So let me welcome Marco Heimeshoff. Hi, Marco. And
Hi.
Paul Rayner. Welcome. So thanks both for joining this conversation. And before we get started, just a quick reminder for people watching or listening this interview. So this is a live stream. You can interact with Marco and Paul during the conversation, dropping comments or questions in the chat on YouTube or LinkedIn. So we will have a look at the questions during the conversation. But now it's time to start. So I leave it to Paul and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alessandra. As mentioned, so I'm very privileged and honored to be here with Marco. Marco is the creator of the Event Sourcing and CQRS Masterclass. He's also the Kandinsky Conference organizer. Kandinsky is coming up next month. He's a speaker, passionate software developer, salsa dancer, and we're here to talk with Marco about the upcoming workshop and also just get to know Marco a little bit more generally. So my job here is to moderate. And for those of you that don't know me, I organize the Explore Domain-Driven Design Conference in the United States and have been active in DDD for quite a while. So Marco, let's start with a potentially spicy question. And one of the basic ideas in domain-driven design is focusing on domain complexity, and then in terms of the solution we bring, choosing appropriate levels of technical complexity. And Eric's talked about, well, if you have little domain complexity, then something more like a CRUD-based solution might be appropriate. I've only ever been involved in event sourcing projects where those decisions have already been made. But I'm wondering, what kind of advice would you give someone when they have to make that choice for themselves? So when would something like event sourcing or potentially CQRS be the right approach on a project? What would you have to say to that question?
That's a very, very simple question with a complex answer. Yeah, thank you so much. So first of all, it's event sourcing and CQRS are patterns that help you. Event sourcing, for example, helps you with semantic coding. So if you have a complex domain where language is very important, which tends to be kind of the core competency of domain-driven design in general, right? So when you're doing core domain analysis, you're realizing, hey, we have processes, there's lots of lingo involved. We want to have the ubiquitous language specifically in code. Events tend to be the best, smallest common denominator when you have domain experts talking about what happens in the business. It's rare that business experts just talk about things and state changes, right? No domain expert says, oh, we have a customer object and the customer name has changed to blah. It's like, no, somebody moved, somebody got married, product got shipped, like things happen in the domain. Those are, of course, simple examples, but anything complex that is behavior driven usually is a chain of events that change your business state. If you want to reflect that in code as close as possible, the slimmest difference you can have between your implementation model and the actual business model is if you take the story and write it into the code. So when semantics matters, event sourcing is a really, really good approach. CQRS, on the other hand, is also the reason why I changed the workshop from the past, where it was mostly a CQRS workshop adding event sourcing. Now it's an event sourcing workshop adding CQRS. CQRS is if you want to separate your models between read and write demands. So that's optimization of implementation details, basically. If you have a lot of information that needs to be read a lot of times, but you only change things rarely, for example, then having a single model that does both basically tie these two different needs together, and it's really hard to optimize properly. You want your behavioral model to be as semantic as possible, as linguistic, language-driven as possible. You want it to be fast executing, and if you want to have a coherent model in a single state for the entire domain, for all the users that you have, right, then you want to have some model that does not need to load a lot of data to represent lots of information. So having a behavioral model that's clear, slim, and behavior-driven and purpose-driven would be then the right side of the CQRS, and the read side can be all the projected information. So instead of having to do a multi-table join every time you read data, you have it pre-projected in the way that you want to consume it already. So those are the good reasons to use CQRS and event sourcing separately, but also even together, they become a really great team, because you can use the events from your domain model, from the command side of your implementation. Everything that happens can be used and consumed by the read models to project into a new data, into different shape of data. So they go really well hand in hand, but they can also be used separately. To answer the first part of the question, like, first of all, you're a lucky person if you ever only came into projects that already had that decision made.
Not only, but
okay, great. Yeah. So I've been in many projects where CQRS and or event sourcing have not even been used. People have highly complex domains and have vastly different needs for reading and writing. There are long-running processes and whatnot, but everything is implemented in a rather cruddy way. And it's not that CQRS and event sourcing is always the better choice for every part of the system. As you said, there are many areas where you have a rather trivial domain, or the behavior is simple to understand, but there's lots of data involved. There are areas where CRUD is perfect. Like if you have a reporting engine, I wouldn't go event source it usually, or build a big CQRS system. There are many areas where just store data in a table, make a smart front end, move on is the fastest way to build a solution. There are lots of other architectures that are also feasible or maybe even optimal for certain areas in the business. But the point is CQRS and event sourcing specifically builds a fundamental new way to think about data, because everything that you read from any kind of storage, be it relational database or graph database or anything else, is basically a projection of things that happened in the business anyway. So using CQRS in business processes is oftentimes the best solution. Not always, but very, very often. So I wouldn't say use it always, but change the default. When you have a core domain or a supporting domain that's complex enough, the default should be event sourcing, and you have to make a good argument to say, oh, we shouldn't use it here because we can harness more or make it cheaper if we use a CRUD system. And then perfectly fine, use a CRUD system wherever applies, wherever applicable. But yeah, the default changes. So that's the bit of long-winded answer for when to use which.
Right. So if I understand correctly, then you're saying that if you apply an event sourcing approach to an area of domain complexity, you're going to have greater or better alignment between the way that the business thinks about the domain and what you're expressing in the code. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's better alignment. It's also easier discoverability for the next people that join the team. So the alignment doesn't need any translation anymore if you actually capture the language. If you model with event storming, for example, and you have a semantic modeling session where you capture what happens in the business. So you have events like, I don't know, shipment has been sent and package has been received and track has been lost. All those events happen and you model them anyway. Translating them into code by having an actual class that has that name, right? Shipment has been sent and the properties are what and where and when, means there is no translation needed. The translation discrepancy becomes smaller and smaller. The usual state-based systems where you have a third normal form table full of data that's connected means somebody has to now go and dig and figure out what does this state change mean regarding to the story business people tell us. And of course, there's like ways to mitigate that, but they are all adding accidental complexity. If you use event sourcing, a lot of that accidental complexity goes down, and it opens up many opportunities for having simpler code and gaining more value out of the system later. Because if you capture all the events that happen in the business, even though they might not have a technical necessity for now, but you're capturing what happens, you can generate value from it later when you realize, oh, whenever people like take stuff out of the shopping cart, we want to know that, right? We want to know what gets taken out and at which time of the year, because we can then change the way we advertise or pre-project our ways of filling the warehouses and all that stuff. So you gain a lot of abilities just from having the language baked into code. Your tests become way more readable. So the translation between understanding what needs to happen and seeing a test and implementation is just reading a story. A proper BDD test, right, written with events and commands would say, given this happened, this happened, this happened, when I want to do that, then expect this happened. It's basically just a story made of messages, but they actually compile, and you don't need a framework around that translates some strings into some technical implementation. So the conversation of developers, architects, and product people gets way more focused on the domain instead of on technical concepts when you implement event sourcing over longer periods of time. There's, of course, an adoption phase, so it's not just trivial to implement it if you've never done it. But once you get there, the conversation becomes more and more domain-driven, which is kind of what we're all about in the DDD community. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned adoption. What are some of the things that you've seen teams struggle with when they come on to event sourcing? Because it definitely sounds like it has a lot of advantages, but it's also a different way of thinking about the code and the domain and the implementation.
Yeah, so on the thinking side, I don't feel that there is a lot of struggle. So when you think about events, that's what you think about anyway when you think processes. That's where you actually just gain clarity. So instead of having to translate the business processes into some kind of technical state change, you basically just translate the events into technical concepts that are also events. That's easier. But yeah, the adoption becomes hard when it comes to proper contextualization. So when folks try to build like a canonical domain model, right, which can work in a CRUD environment, but if you try to do that with event sourcing, you get a blown up event store very fast. You have like thousands or millions of events. The naming is either weak, so the names don't really mean much, or they become...
Because you're trying to cover too much ground, is that right, semantically? Yeah.
So the idea, one of the things that I want to say need to do, maybe it's a strong recommendation, but actually I lean more on the area of you need to actually have a proper context boundary to say within this bounded context, within this area of sales, advertisement, whatever the domain is you're working in, you need a bounded context that has clearly defined events, where the language is clearly specified, where the terms mean specific things, and the properties within your events are the ones that you really need and not something for someone else that you don't care about. Right. And they have their own events. And then you need to make proper translation happen between those contexts. That is one of the biggest hurdles in the beginning that I find, because you have different teams learning and moving at different paces. If our team starts using event sourcing, we model proper events, and now we want to integrate with your events, but you're using it differently or not at all at the moment, and we have different paces, then the translation between our context becomes a technical difficulty, which is something that we're going to address in the workshop, as well as how can you build anti-corruption layers around that? How can you make gradual translation and gradual moving forward as a whole company, not just as a single team, actually applicable?
Right. And I've heard people say over the years, event sourcing is not an overall architectural pattern that you're trying to apply across an entire thing. It sounds like there are places where a team could even adopt it more surgically within a project, right? Like they could be using a regular third normal form database for user administration or something like that. But then if there's one area where they do have a lot of complexity within that application, they could apply that. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So picking the area where it really gives you benefit and where the investment into that modeling and also building the infrastructure is worth it is super important. There are areas, sometimes it's a whole bounded context that you want to build event sourced, but you can even choose within a bounded context just to have certain decisions made event sourced, some aggregates or some decider patterns, while other parts are still in a normal form or in an object store. So for example, if you have something like a document store, right? You use PDFs that you store. You don't want the PDFs to be part of your events, and whenever the PDF changes, having that event source seems like rather overkill. So have a document store that has an ID generated, but then the fact that a new PDF has been generated, that a new version is now accepted,
the actual document workflow, right?
The workflow itself can be event sourced while the documents are not. And this is just one of many examples of hybrid models. Very often, people tend to use event sourcing for a greenfield application, right? Because it's easy to start from scratch, but it actually helps a lot with transforming legacy systems into more clearly defined contexts that you can separate from the legacy by implementing event propagation into the legacy system itself or as an anti-corruption layer. So understanding what happens here when this data changes, it actually means X, Y, that happens. Okay, great. So let's make this an event, publish it, and have a new projection that basically in a CQRS fashion, starts to make sense of it, and then you start step by step to extract a feature until your new projection completely covers what the old system was doing, or complete enough, and then you can basically start exchanging things. So that means you have an old legacy system with a third normal form database, adding event sourcing to it. And that's also something you can do gradually. So people often start with like Event Store or Current DB or something like that. We've also built systems where we just added an SQL table called Event Store, publish events in there, and then start building out from there. So you can keep transactional
even in the legacy
consistency.
database, you're saying?
Yeah, even in the legacy database. So this is a strategy that helps you to get old parts of the system out and stay consistent with the legacy system. You can make transactionally sure that the new events get stored, but also the changes in the old tables are made either together or not at all. And that's one way to get legacy systems cleaned up step by step.
Yeah, so I heard a couple of things. So one is what you're talking about in terms of teams that might be struggling with adoption. They don't have to go all in. They don't have to do greenfield. In fact, quite the opposite. They could be applying this technique more surgically with a legacy system, or even in their current code base, maybe even if it's not legacy. So are there other ways that teams have to kind of overcome these adoption challenges? So these are good suggestions. So what else?
There are many things that I have seen gone wrong in the past. One of these struggles I see often is that people, when they have never experienced event sourcing, there's a lot of fear of the new thing, right? And then a lot of uncertainty of how to implement. So they choose a simplistic domain to make it happen, to get some hands-on. And that is often dangerous when you pick a too simplistic domain. Like if you, my very first try, like 10, 12 years ago or so, never mind, many years ago, was a configuration domain. So we configured a screen, and then you can say, hey, okay, what is the width, the height, the colors, and whatnot. And then you had like configuration added, configuration changed, configuration deleted. You basically had CRUD events. Right. And because we didn't want to have like the whole thing, we made every little button and nook and cranny you could change its own event. But it felt like a lot of design overhead. It was super, super hard to do. And this was like we built infrastructure en masse for no benefit. And that's the whole point. If your domain does not fit event sourcing, if the complexity isn't high enough or it's not semantic in nature, you don't gain anything, but you have all the costs. So picking a simplistic domain to practice is a bad choice, or let's say a suboptimal choice. But also you don't want to practice in your core domain, because if you fail, then you probably fail hard. So finding some area, something that you can practice with, finding the right complexity to start with is a struggle. That's something we can give advice on, of course, right? I mean, it's not hard to find, but you need somebody to guide you in the right direction there. So the complexity, the initial complexity of the thing. The other is you get fearful rejection from people from within the team. Some people just don't want to try event sourcing, or they've heard bad things about it. By now, the industry is matured enough. Many people used event sourcing before, and I've often heard things like, "Oh yeah, we tried event sourcing. That doesn't work because," and then some reasons, and then they fight it for the rest of their lives because they don't want to deal with the pain again they felt in the first try, and that's totally understandable. You can replace it with any technology name, right? Once you get a bad rap with something, it's hard to overcome the bad name it now has. But my advice for that is, if you pick the right example and you start with a simple enough example that has semantic complexity but technical simplicity, you see the benefits popping up so fast that many people that do event sourcing over longer periods of time feel it is the default for domain models, which it shouldn't. Well, it's not the only model there, but it always becomes the first thing to think about. What are the events that happen here, and how can we gain benefit from that?
Right. Well, it seems like in terms of how you might model like you mentioned, semantic complexity and the document example. So if you had this complicated workflow that a document can flow through, then you might model that in a traditional third normal form databases. You've got a document ID and then all these possible states, like you're modeling the state machine inside of the database, right? It would be one way to approach that. Whereas what I'm hearing with event sourcing is you say, no, let's not do that. Let's figure out what the actual state changes are and model those as explicit things. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, and so you model them explicitly, and the state change becomes secondary in nature. It is the business state that matters more. Like, what state is the business in? And you oftentimes have even different context in the flow of a document. Like a document is in drafting, right? Let's take this training, for example. While I was working on the training initially, it's like a drafting phase. I propose how the abstract is written and what happens in the session, but this is not the final thing. Once we're getting to the final, it gets published, and then when it's published, it's not in draft anymore. Now, this is something that we can work on like how can we make this agenda work properly, right? So you have a document, but the document has different stages and different abilities in different stages. Different things can happen to it or with it. Different people are responsible for it. So even there is one document, the CQRS and event sourcing training, it can have multiple bounded contexts, and each of them can have their own little event source for whatever happens in them. And then you basically can use events to translate from one state to the next. So after drafting has been published, that's the one event I care about. I don't care about any of the history in my new context, sales and execution. So yeah, those are proper separations. And then the state machine itself is modeled in a way of, hey, if this happened, any meaningful business event that changes your business capabilities or the state that you are in now from a business point of view or domain point of view, gets published and then projected into internal state for behavior, but also into projection state for visualization on screens and so on.
Got it.
So yeah, you got that right.
Yeah. So then we've been talking about some of the challenges. So let's flip that around then. What are some of the marks of successful implementations that you've seen?
Oh, the successful implementation, things you can see when you did event sourcing right is all of a sudden changes in the model feel easy. So whenever something happens in the business, right, business people or domain experts come and say, oh, look, up until this year, this is how we work, but now we need to change this. The market is changing. There are new laws, new rules, or we're just optimizing for whatever reason. And they describe in words what they want. You do an event storming, like looking at the back wall here. You model with people what the flow should be. And then you can read that story already in your domain tests and in your source code. And those are not just words written in Gherkin or something. That's just events and commands implemented. And when those change, you can translate that change very easily into implementation. Right. And all of a sudden, experimenting with what-if scenarios, implementing events that don't exist yet, but say, what if this would happen? And then you can try, because you can just project an event into some other state, and all of a sudden experimenting with the domain, exploring the domain, changing the domain, those things become really easy. Adopting or adding new people to the team and showing them the source code. If you've done event sourcing right, if you have semantic messages in general, people can look through the code and they understand the story, because your code all of a sudden reads like a business story instead of technical state changes and data loads. So that also comes with a caveat. It requires to have your domain model and your technical model separated. This is where hexagonal architecture is part of a good implementation of a domain model. But yeah, if your domain model is clearly separated and uses event sourcing properly, it reads like a business story in source code. Just without you asking a question there, just had a thought. This is also why I will use a little bit of AI, like 1 or 2 hours spent on that, how to implement proper code. When you define your language properly and the messages are defined really, really well in code, contextual language and clear definitions is what large language models optimize for, right? So once you have that, you have your semantic BDD tests telling any kind of AI like Claude or ChatGPT to say, hey, can you implement this decider pattern, or can you implement this aggregate, given that all these semantic tests are here? I have seen this succeed on a level that is scary. It's faster and oftentimes way better than what I could implement in way more time. So yeah. That's also
so I'm hearing that LLMs have a good understanding of these patterns, is what you're saying. Like they
have a good understanding of these patterns because they know what developers know, but they have an easy time reading event-sourced code. That's what I'm saying. It's like if you have state changes in database tables and objects and whatnot, it can still understand things. But if your business model is implemented in semantic messages, then the LLM is reading the story just like a human would and understands, oh yeah, if the gate is shut, the car can't drive through it. I understand that. So, and then they can infer meaning from it and implement better and even propose better future state changes, etc. So it's a really good handoff if you use LLMs to implement code. Semantic coding helps you a long way.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, so that's one area where you, it sounds like you're emphasizing more in your teaching these days. So what else do you tend to emphasize you said you've been doing this for a long time. So what kinds of things come up in your workshops now? Not just front-loading events, sourcing, and incorporating some LLM, CodeGen. What other things do you tend to focus on these days?
So there is different areas that seem to stabilize over longer periods of time. So the one is pragmatic models, is something I've been focusing the last decade on. Instead of applying any method that you learn, like CQRS by the book or event sourcing by the book or whatever, it's figuring out what do we need in this specific situation. And what I tend to do in all my workshops is, regardless if it's modeling or implementation workshops, I don't want people to go away with having understood how the method works properly and then follow a recipe. I want people to become tool makers themselves. So being able to do CQRS as it's described, cool, but understanding why it's described that way and figuring out, oh, I have a specific problem here. This is how I could separate my models, right? I have a projection model that I need, or I have a command execution model, or maybe the workflow needs a kind of both, but let's just adapt it to whatever we need now. Pick from all the patterns, understand the why behind things, and then build whatever is the simplest thing you can to make your solution work, while focusing on contextual semantics, which is the DDD part that always chimes in. So that's one thing that I really focus on. The other is contextualization, using proper bounded context, having clear defined boundaries, because realizing that everything is always socio-technical. There is no technical model without the group that builds it and the people that need it. Building proper boundaries, right? Good fences make good neighbors, and so on. Having clear boundaries and understanding what your relationship to your neighbors is. Even though my workshop is not a domain modeling workshop, we will not do like a full day of context mapping, but it's definitely part of the teaching to say all of this only makes sense if you understand your contextual boundaries and your team responsibilities. And that also changes the way how you implement. If I understand that my counterpart on the other side of the fence has no clue what an event is, or doesn't have the capacity for event sourcing, we will build a different kind of projection interaction. Maybe there will be some kind of method calling, gRPC, whatever. But if there is a team that also fully on event sourced, we can actually transform events, communicate through business lingo in technical terms. So those are things I focus on strongly.
Yeah. So what do you hope that attendees will get out of the workshop? So you mentioned, having them think beyond just the recipes and think about what are ways that they might implement it. What other things might attendees expect to encounter?
Yeah, so this is where the advanced part of this workshop comes in. It's the advanced CQRS and advanced event sourcing and CQRS workshop. I want people to be able afterwards to properly choose when to choose which tool, which method to apply, to build their own if necessary. Have a strong focus on distributed processes, on sagas, on long-running processes, and make them fail gracefully. This is one of the big struggles I've seen in many companies that adopt event sourcing. It works for local models, it works for small processes, but the moment something is a longer-running process, and then something fails in between, how do you roll back a long process, or how do you come out alive or make a business gain out of something that technically failed? So modeling these properly and understanding where's the difference between a technical problem and a domain problem, how can we put this all into semantics and really figure out orchestrated long-running processes. So that's one of the main focus points. I want people to really get away.
Which is a challenge if you're not doing event sourcing, right? So yeah. All right. Well, cool. Well, apart from we mentioned your involvement in Kandinsky and the workshop. What else are you doing these days?
Oh yeah.
What should our audience know about?
Yeah, what should the audience know? I haven't been coding for quite a while, like for 4 or 5 years as a job. It was merely a hobby on the side. But for the last 3 months, I've been working on tryitwithan.com, which is a specification by example editor that takes event storming from a mirror board and makes you be able to write BDD tests and then extract a code generator from there. Super cool. And I'm also a game developer now. I've made a hobby in the pandemic.
Nice.
So all of the stickies you see in the background are from a game that you can find under jumpandrogue.com, which will be published next year. But yeah, it's that's a different workshop, but the teachings that domain-driven design can bring to game development are also quite surprising. But that would fill more time than we have here now.
Sure, yeah. Well, any final thoughts for our audience? Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we finish up?
Not about the workshop, but I would highly recommend to come to Kandinsky to the conference.
Yes.
We have an open space day, and Paul Rayner is also there. Hi, Paul. So the virtual DDD community, the DDD community around the whole world will gather, and we focus strongly on collaboration and getting your hands on all the methods you can try and think of. And yeah, I will host multiple sessions about coding with AI, because that seems to be a topic many people struggle with these days. And showing people how you can really incorporate this into your development process, something I also find quite important. So join us there and meet the Paul Rayner and the Marco and everyone else.
That's right. Well, should we hand it?
Oh, we lost maybe Paul.
Oh, we lost the Paul.
Yeah, we lost.
That is a
Paul.
beautiful last picture. Thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure having you here.
But we were quite at the end, so okay, maybe Paul is coming back. Can you hear us, Paul? No, I don't think so. Oh, yes, Paul, hi. Okay, we can maybe start closing the episode, and I'm just reminding people that there are a few seats available for your workshop, the Event Sourcing and CQRS Masterclass in Berlin. So please come and join us, drop us an email, scan the QR code, so join us. And also, so I'm just closing the episode now, because I see also Paul is not coming back. And I thank you so much, Marco. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for your insights, for all the insights you shared. And I also thank Paul that disappeared just now. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. And then see you to the next episode.